The orange cat sits in the snow beside Anders, as they watch smoke rise weakly from the Onstead cabin across the valley, where 5 people huddle around a fire that cannot keep them warm. Inside the double-walled fortress his father built, the cabin inside a cabin that the whole settlement mocked as madness, Anders's family sits comfortably in shirt-sleeves while the 5th day of the blizzard buries Montana territory in white silence. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if stories of forgotten frontier wisdom move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The fire in the Hofstad cabin burned hot enough to make the stones glow, but Sigrid could not stop shivering. It was the 14th of February, 1841, and the temperature outside had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Inside their log cabin, built the previous summer using methods every Norwegian immigrant knew, the temperature hovered somewhere near 40 degrees despite the roaring flames consuming log after log of seasoned pine. Torsten Hofstad fed another split length into the fireplace and watched his wife pull the wool blankets tighter around her shoulders. She sat less than 3 feet from the hearth, as close as safety allowed, and still her lips showed the faint blue tinge that terrified him. Their 3 children, Ingrid, Anders, and little Bjorn, huddled together on the sleeping platform in the corner, wrapped in every spare blanket the family owned. The cabin was not poorly built by frontier standards. Torsten had notched the corners carefully, selected reasonably straight logs, and chinked the gaps with moss and clay, as his father had taught him in the old country. The structure kept out rain and provided shelter from wind, which was all most families expected from their homes. But on nights like this, when Arctic cold descended from Canada and settled across the Montana territory, the gaps between logs became pathways for freezing air, and no amount of fire could warm the space faster than the cold stole the heat away. Torsten had burned through half their winter wood supply in the past month. At this rate they would run out before spring, which meant choosing between freezing and dismantling their furniture for fuel. Every family in the scattered settlement faced the same arithmetic, the same impossible choice. Winter in the mountains killed people with brutal regularity, and everyone accepted this as the price of living in paradise during the other 9 months of the year. Sigrid's shivering worsened around midnight. Torsten moved her even closer to the fire, close enough that he worried about her nightdress catching sparks. He sent Ingrid to boil water for tea, hoping the hot liquid would help. Anders watched from the sleeping platform with wide, frightened eyes, old enough at 8 years to understand that something was wrong, but too young to know what to do about it. By 2 in the morning, Sigrid had stopped shivering. Torsten knew enough about cold to understand this was worse, not better. He held her against his chest, trying to share his body heat, while the fire consumed wood as fast as he could feed it. The cabin's interior walls showed a thin layer of frost in the corners farthest from the fireplace. Wind found every gap in the chinking and exploited it, creating drafts that pulled heat up through the roof and out into the frozen night. Sigrid died an hour before dawn, 6 feet from a fire hot enough to hurt Torsten's face, when he leaned close to add wood. She simply stopped breathing while he held her, her body finally surrendering to cold that even flame could not defeat. The children woke to find their father sitting motionless, their mother's body cooling in his arms, and the fire still burning uselessly against the winter dark. Spring came to Montana territory in late April 1842, melting the snow that had buried Sigrid's grave on the hillside above the settlement. Torsten emerged from winter with his children intact, but something fundamental had broken inside him. The other settlers expected grief, expected silence, perhaps even expected him to abandon the frontier and return to civilization. What they did not expect was obsession. Torsten began studying cabins with the intensity of a man possessed. He visited every structure in the settlement, examining construction methods, measuring gaps between logs with his fingers, noting where frost accumulated on interior walls. He borrowed a small notebook from the trading post and filled it with sketches and observations written in a mixture of Norwegian and English. Neighbors found him standing outside their homes in the early morning, watching smoke rise from chimneys, tracking how wind patterns affected draft and heat loss. Lars Onstad, whose cabin stood closest to the Hofstad property, complained that Torsten's behavior had become unsettling. "The man stands in the trees watching my house like he means to rob it. Yet," Lars told anyone who would listen, "grief has touched his mind." Others nodded in agreement. A widower studying cabin construction instead of preparing fields for planting was not behaving rationally. Anders watched his father's transformation with confusion and growing worry. Torsten barely spoke during meals, his attention fixed on the notebook that now accompanied him everywhere. At night, after the children were asleep, Anders would wake to find his father sitting at their rough-hewn table, drawing diagrams by candlelight. The sketches showed cabins within cabins, walls separated by space, strange configurations that made no sense to a child's understanding. Ingrid, at 11 years old, tried to maintain household order while her father descended into his private world of measurements and calculations. She cooked, tended Bjorn, and kept Anders from bothering their father too much. But even she grew frightened when Torsten began dismantling sections of their own cabin's interior, examining how the logs had been fitted, studying the failure points where cold had penetrated. Knut Viken, who had been Torsten's closest friend in the settlement, visited in mid-May to express concern. He found Torsten on his hands and knees, inspecting the gap between the bottom log and the stone foundation. "The planting season is here," Knut said carefully. "Your fields need attention." Torsten looked up as if surprised to find another person present. "Heat rises," he said. "Everyone knows this, but cold falls, and cold also flows like water, seeking the lowest points. The bottom gaps are worst." Knut left without response, deeply troubled. By June, Torsten had examined every cabin within 5 miles. He had documented 23 different construction methods, identified 12 common failure points, and filled his notebook with observations about heat movement, airflow, and the physics of survival. The settlement considered him broken by tragedy, a man whose grief had curdled into madness. They did not understand that Torsten Hofstad had moved beyond grief into something more dangerous, absolute determination to ensure no one else would die the way Sigrid had died. The first Sunday in July, Torsten Hofstad called a gathering at the settlement's common ground, a cleared space near the trading post where families met for important discussions. 17 households sent representatives, curious about what the strange Norwegian widower wanted to announce. Most expected he would declare his intention to leave Montana Territory, perhaps return to his family in the old country. What they heard instead left them stunned into silence. Torsten stood before them, holding his worn notebook, his 3 children sitting quietly behind him. He had not rehearsed his words, had not prepared a persuasive speech. He simply stated his conclusion as if reporting an observable fact of nature. "I'm going to build 2 cabins," he said in his accented English, "one cabin inside another cabin, with air between the walls. This will stop the cold from stealing heat." The silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds before Lars Onstad began laughing. Others joined him, not from cruelty, but from the sheer absurdity of the statement. 2 cabins, one inside the other. The idea seemed like something a child would propose, not a grown man. "You mean to build a cabin and then build a second cabin around the first one?" Lars asked, wiping tears from his eyes. "That is what you spent 3 months learning?" Torsten nodded seriously. "Dead air does not move. Moving air steals heat through touching, through flowing past warm surfaces. If I trap air between 2 walls, the air cannot flow. The heat cannot escape easily. The inner cabin stays warm with small fire. The outer cabin takes the wind, the cold, the weather. They do not touch each other." Knut Viken stepped forward, his expression concerned rather than mocking. "Torsten, my friend, do you understand how much work this would require? How many trees you would need to fell? You would use 200 logs or more. That is enough timber to build 3 normal cabins. And for what? For empty space filled with air? Not empty, Torsten corrected. Full of still air. Still air is the best insulation that exists. He opened his notebook and showed sketches, crude diagrams with measurements labeled in Norwegian. In my country, we build storehouses with double walls for keeping food cold in summer. The principle is same, but reversed. If double walls keep heat out, they also keep heat in. The gathered settlers exchanged glances. The logic had a certain sense to it, but the impracticality overwhelmed any theoretical benefit. You have 3 children to feed, Lars said, his tone no longer amused. You have fields to plant. You cannot spend an entire summer building walls that hold nothing but air. This is madness born from grief. We understand you hurt, Torsten, but this plan will destroy your family. Torsten closed his notebook and looked at the faces surrounding him. He saw pity, concern, and dismissal. He saw no understanding. I start tomorrow, he said quietly. Anyone who wishes to help is welcome. No one accepted the invitation. The gathering dispersed, and Torsten walked home with his children, ready to begin the impossible work alone. Torsten spent 3 days in early July searching for the perfect building site. He rejected the obvious locations near the creek where most settlers built, where water access made daily life convenient. He rejected the sheltered valley bottoms where cold air pooled on winter nights. He walked the hills surrounding the settlement with Anders trailing behind him, the boy struggling to understand what his father sought. On the 4th day, Torsten found what he needed. A slight rise approximately 200 yards from the creek, elevated perhaps 15 feet, above the surrounding terrain. 3 large pine trees grew at the northern edge, positioned to block the worst winter winds without shading the cabin site itself. The ground sloped gently away in all directions, ensuring water would drain rather than pool. Most importantly, the location offered clear sight lines in every direction, allowing anyone in the cabin to see approaching weather, wildlife, or visitors from a considerable distance. Anders watched his father pace the ground, marking corners with stakes, measuring distances with a length of rope marked at intervals. "Why so far from water, Papa?" the boy asked. Torsten knelt beside his son and pointed toward the creek below them. "In spring, that creek rises. Sometimes it floods. Water seeks the low places. We build high." He swept his arm around the horizon. "Also, we can see everything from here, no surprises." The settlement watched from a distance as Torsten began felling trees. He did not cut the nearest timber, but walked considerable distances to find specific trees, rejecting dozens for every one he selected. He wanted straight trunks with minimal taper, pine logs approximately 12 to 14 inches in diameter. Each tree had to be examined, evaluated, approved before his axe touched bark. Knut Viken rode out to the building site one afternoon and found Torsten stripping bark from a felled log using a draw knife, a specialized tool with handles on both ends of a curved blade. The work was brutal, requiring hours per log, but Torsten worked with methodical patience. "Why remove the bark?" Knut asked. "Everyone leaves bark on logs. It gives extra insulation." Torsten paused his work, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Bark creates irregular surface. Bark holds moisture. Bark compresses differently than wood. When I fit these logs together, I want smooth surfaces, no gaps, tight seal. Bark prevents this." He returned to his draw knife, pulling the blade toward himself in long strips, revealing pale wood beneath the dark outer layer. "You will work yourself to death," Knut said quietly. "All summer for one project while your children need food, need clothing, need a father who is present." Torsten did not stop working. "My children need to not freeze in their beds while fire burns 6 feet away. That is what they need most." By the end of July, Torsten had 40 logs cut, hauled, and stripped. They lay in neat rows near the building site, drying in the summer sun. The settlement's crops grew tall in irrigated fields. Torsten's own small plot, tended minimally by Ingrid, showed sparse growth. The cost of his obsession was becoming visible, measurable in bushels that would not be harvested. August brought heat that made heavy labor nearly unbearable, but Torsten worked through it with relentless focus. He began with the foundation, a detail most frontier builders skipped entirely. Using a shovel he had sharpened to a fine edge, he dug a trench around the cabin's perimeter, 8 inches deep and 12 inches wide. Anders and Ingrid helped gather stones from the creek bed, carrying them in canvas sacks until their shoulders ached. Torsten filled the foundation trench with stones, selecting each one for fit and stability, creating a level base that would prevent settling and keep the bottom logs off the damp earth. The work took 6 days. Lars Onstad rode past and shook his head. A foundation for a cabin? What next? Marble columns? But Torsten ignored the mockery and continued fitting stones until the foundation sat perfectly level in all directions. The first course of logs went down in mid-August. Torsten had cut notches at each end using a technique he had learned from his father in Norway. The saddle notch required precision, each cut shaped to lock the logs together while allowing them to settle without creating gaps. He worked alone, using a cant hook to roll the heavy logs into position, adjusting each one until it sat exactly right. Anders learned to read his father's needs without words. When Torsten reached for the draw knife, Anders handed it to him. When a log needed minor shaping, Anders steadied it while his father worked. The boy understood little of the engineering principles driving the construction, but he understood dedication, understood that his father was building something that mattered more than anything else in the world. By September, the outer cabin's walls had reached shoulder height. 12 courses of logs, each one fitted with obsessive care, each gap between logs packed with Torsten's special chinking mixture. He had developed the formula through experimentation, mixing clay from the creek bank with horsehair obtained from the trading post and pine resin he had boiled down from sap collected in the forest. The mixture took 3 days to prepare properly, simmering over low fire until it reached the right consistency. Torsten applied the chinking while it was warm and pliable, packing it into the gaps between logs. With a flat wooden tool he had carved for the purpose. As the mixture dried, it created a seal that was flexible enough to accommodate the log's minor movements, but strong enough to block wind and water. The horsehair acted as reinforcement, preventing cracks. The pine resin made it waterproof and gave it adhesive properties that bonded to the wood. Neighbors observed that Torsten's spring planting had produced minimal harvest. His small field of wheat showed poor growth from neglect. While other families prepared for winter by storing vegetables and grain, the Hofstad family would face the cold months with limited supplies. The settlement women brought occasional meals, motivated by concern for the children. Torsten accepted the charity without comment and returned to his building the next morning. By late September, the outer cabin's walls stood complete at 14 courses high, ready for the roof structure. But Torsten did not begin the roof. Instead, he started building a second cabin inside the first, and this was when the settlement's mockery transformed from casual jokes into serious concern about his mental state. The inner cabin began 4 feet from the outer walls on all sides, creating a perimeter of empty space that made no sense to anyone watching. Torsten laid out the inner cabin's foundation stones with the same obsessive care he had used for the outer structure, creating a level base for what appeared to be a child's playhouse nested inside the larger building. "He has gone completely mad," Lars Onstad declared at the trading post, where men gathered to discuss the strange construction. "Building a second cabin inside the first. The space between them is wasted, useless. He could store tools there, keep livestock in winter, use it for something practical. Instead, he leaves it empty." Others agreed. The air gap seemed like proof of derangement, a widower's grief manifesting in architectural insanity. Anders felt the weight of the mockery when settlement children teased him at the creek where families gathered water. "Your papa is building a dollhouse," they sang. "Little cabin in a big cabin, waste of trees, waste of time." Anders fought back tears and said nothing, but at home he asked his father the question that haunted him. "Papa, why do they laugh at us?" Torsten stopped his work and knelt beside his son. "They laugh because they do not understand. Air that does not move cannot steal heat. The space between cabins is not empty. It is full of air that will trap warmth inside, keep cold outside. When winter comes, they will understand." Anders wanted to believe him, but belief was hard when everyone else thought his father was wrong. The inner cabin's logs were slightly smaller than the outer cabin's, 10 to 12 inches in diameter, carefully selected and stripped. Torsten used the same notching technique, the same methodical fitting. But these logs showed a golden honey color, fresh and bright, contrasting sharply with the outer cabin's weathered, gray-brown timber. The visual difference made the double structure even more striking. A gleaming new cabin sat inside a worn shell like a jewel in a rough case. Ingrid helped with the chinking, learning to mix the clay and horsehair and resin, learning to pack it into gaps with the wooden tool. She was 12 years old and understood more than Anders about their family's precarious situation. Their food stores were inadequate. Their father's reputation in the settlement had shifted from respected immigrant to object of pity and concern. But she also saw something the mockers did not see: her father's absolute certainty, his unshakable conviction that he was building something that would save them. October brought cold mornings with frost on the grass, reminding everyone that winter approached. Torsten worked faster now, racing against the season. The inner cabin's walls reached completion at 12 courses high, slightly lower than the outer. Structure. The space between the two cabins remained constant at 4 feet on all sides, a gap that seemed to mock the observer with its emptiness. Torsten spent 2 weeks on chinking alone, sealing both the inner and outer cabins with his clay mixture, but he applied different standards to each structure. The inner cabin received perfect sealing, every gap packed completely, every crack filled. He inspected each joint multiple times, adding more mixture wherever he detected the slightest imperfection. The inner cabin had to be absolutely airtight. The outer cabin's chinking was adequate, but not perfect. Torsten left minor gaps intentionally, allowing the outer structure to breathe slightly. Anders asked why the difference mattered. Torsten sat his son down and drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick, trying to explain principles of heat and air movement to a 9-year-old mind. "Heat moves 3 ways, Torsten said, drawing arrows in the dirt. "It shines like light from the fire. It warms things by touching them, and it flows away when air moves past warm surfaces and carries the heat with it. The 3rd way, the flowing air, that is what killed your mother." He drew a cabin with gaps. "Wind comes through cracks, touches warm air inside, carries heat away. No fire can keep up with this stealing." Anders studied the dirt drawings, trying to understand. Torsten drew a second diagram, 2 cabins with space between. "Inner cabin is sealed tight. No air flows through it. Heat stays inside. Outer cabin takes the wind. Wind can flow through small gaps in outer cabin, but it never touches the inner cabin walls. The air between cabins does not move because it has nowhere to go. Still, air does not steal heat. This is the secret." The boy's face showed concentration and partial comprehension. "So the outer cabin protects the inner cabin from wind?" Torsten nodded. "Yes, and the air between them is like a blanket. Not a blanket made of wool, but a blanket made of trapped air. Same principle." Ingrid listened to the explanation while stirring a pot of chinking mixture over the fire. She understood more than Anders, understood that her father was applying principles from the old country, adapting techniques used for root cellars and storehouses to create something new. Whether it would work remained uncertain, but the logic was sound, even if the execution seemed excessive. Knut Viken visited again in late October, bringing a haunch of venison as a gift. He found Torsten packing chinking into the inner cabin's final gaps. Winter is 3 weeks away, maybe 4, Knut said carefully. You have no roof yet on either structure. If snow comes early, this entire project fails. Torsten did not look up from his work. The roof goes on next. It will be finished before the first snow. The roof construction represented the most complex engineering challenge Torsten faced. 2 independent roof systems had to be built, one atop the inner cabin and another covering the entire outer structure with a chimney passing through both. The work required precision and strength that tested even Torsten's considerable determination. He began with the inner cabin's roof in early November. Ridge poles of 8-inch diameter were notched to sit securely on the top course of logs, spanning the width of the structure. Torsten spaced them 18 inches apart, closer than standard construction required, creating a framework strong enough to support significant weight. Across these ridge poles, he laid split planks he had hewn flat on one side, each plank overlapping the next like shingles to shed water. Anders watched from below as his father worked on the sloped roof surface, moving with careful deliberation. The boy's heart pounded with fear every time Torsten reached for another plank or adjusted his position. A fall from that height onto the logs below could kill or cripple. But Torsten moved with the confidence of a man who had built structures in Norway, who understood his own capabilities and limitations. Over the split planks, Torsten laid birch bark in multiple overlapping layers. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and flexible, prized for roof construction throughout the northern forests. But Torsten did not stop with bark alone. He spread his clay mixture over the bark in a thin layer, sealing every potential leak point. The mixture added weight, but created a roof that would not drip during spring thaw or summer thunderstorms. The chimney complicated everything. Torsten had built a stone fireplace in one corner of the inner cabin, constructing it with flat river stones and clay mortar. The chimney rose through the inner cabin's roof, and he sealed around it carefully with extra clay and strips of metal he had obtained from the trading post at considerable expense. The metal flashing prevented water from entering where stone met wood. The outer cabin's roof went up in mid-November, with winter threatening daily. Torsten used the same technique but scaled larger, with ridge poles spanning the greater width and supporting planks that covered both the inner cabin and the 4-foot gap surrounding it. The outer roof had to clear the inner cabin's peak by at least 2 feet, creating a layered appearance visible from outside. Where the chimney passed through the outer roof, Torsten built a frame around it, maintaining the air gap even at this critical junction. The chimney stood free in the space between roofs, not touching the outer structure, allowing air to circulate around it for fire safety. More metal flashing sealed the outer roof penetration. Finally, over both roofs, Torsten laid sod. Living grass and soil covered the birch bark and clay, creating a final layer of insulation and fire protection. The multiple layers made each roof extraordinarily heavy, but the robust log construction supported the weight easily. By late November, both roofs were complete, and the double cabin stood weatherproof, waiting for a winter's test. While most frontier cabins had one small window, or none at all, Torsten installed 4 windows in his inner cabin, an extravagance that provoked fresh mockery from the settlement. Glass windows were expensive luxuries that few could afford, and even those who could questioned the wisdom of creating multiple openings that would leak precious heat during winter. Torsten could not afford glass, but he had developed an alternative. He stretched heavy canvas across wooden frames he had built to exact dimensions, creating tight, flat surfaces. The canvas alone would provide light while blocking wind, but Torsten went further. He applied his clay and pine resin mixture to both sides of the canvas, building up layers until the fabric was embedded in a 1/2-inch thickness of the waterproof compound. The process took days per window. Torsten worked in the shelter of the outer cabin, keeping his mixture warm enough to remain pliable, spreading it evenly across the canvas with a flat wooden tool. Each layer had to dry partially before the next was applied. The result was a translucent composite material that resembled amber, allowing diffused light to enter while creating a surface far stronger than rawhide, which most trappers used when they bothered with window coverings. Anders helped hold the frame steady while his father worked. The boy was fascinated by how the canvas transformed under the layers of mixture, changing from flexible fabric to rigid panel. When held up to sunlight, the finished windows glowed with warm honey tones, and objects on the other side appeared as soft shadows rather than clear shapes. 2 windows flanked the door on the lower level, positioned to provide light for working and cooking. 2 smaller windows were set into the gable area above, creating additional illumination and allowing warm air to circulate near the roof peak. Each window had a thick wooden shutter on the interior that could be secured with a wooden bar, providing extra insulation on the coldest nights and security if needed. Lars Onstad visited the construction site and laughed when he saw the windows. 4 windows! You are building a church, not a cabin. Every opening is a place where heat escapes. You will freeze in the dark trying to keep warm or burn in the light trying to see. There is no winning with this design. Torsten was installing the final window frame and did not pause his work to respond. But Ingrid, who was helping pack clay around the frame's edges, spoke up with surprising sharpness. Our mother froze in a cabin with no windows and a fire that burned all night. Perhaps more openings and better walls is not the foolishness you think it is. Lars had no response to that. He left without further comment, and Torsten allowed himself a small smile while his daughter's words hung in the cold November air. The children were beginning to understand what he was building and why it mattered. That understanding was worth more than the settlement's approval. By the first week of December, all 4 windows were installed, their amber surfaces catching the weak winter sunlight and glowing like lanterns even before fire was lit inside. Torsten spent 3 weeks building the inner cabin's door, an investment of time that seemed absurd for a single component. Most frontier doors were simple affairs constructed in an afternoon. Planks held together with crosspieces hung on leather hinges or wooden pegs. Torsten's door was an engineering project that consumed his complete attention through late November and into December. He started with planks hewn from a single large pine tree he had selected specifically for this purpose. The tree had to have dense, straight grain without knots or weak points. Torsten cut the tree, hauled it to the building site, and spent 4 days splitting and shaping planks using his draw knife and hand tools. Each plank measured 3 inches thick and was shaped to precise dimensions. The planks were assembled using tongue and groove joinery, a technique Torsten had seen on warehouse doors and trading posts. He cut a groove along one edge of each plank and a protruding tongue on the opposite edge. When fitted together, the planks interlocked, creating a door that was effectively a single solid piece of wood. The work required exact measurements and careful cutting. A groove too shallow or a tongue too thick would prevent proper fitting. Anders watched his father work with patient focus that bordered on meditation. Each cut was considered, tested, adjusted. Torsten rejected 2 planks entirely after spending hours shaping them, declaring the grain unsuitable. He started those pieces over from scratch. The boy learned that quality construction required not just skill, but the willingness to redo work that failed to meet exacting standards. Once the planks were assembled, Torsten reinforced the door with iron brackets he had purchased from the trading post, at significant cost. The brackets were mounted diagonally across the interior face in an X pattern. Torsten drilled holes through the door planks and bolted the brackets in place using square-cut nails that went completely through the 3-inch thickness and were clinched over on the exterior side. The door weighed approximately 90 pounds when complete, but it was rigid enough to support its own weight without warping. Torsten had created something that could withstand the impact of a charging animal or a desperate human without failing. The hinges represented another innovation. Rather than attaching them to the surface of the door frame, Torsten cut rectangular mortises into both the door and the log frame, pockets where the hinges would sit flush. He then bolted the hinges through the logs, using iron pins similar to those he had used at the cabin corners. To remove these hinges, someone would need to destroy the logs themselves. The locking mechanism was equally sophisticated. A heavy wooden beam slid horizontally through iron brackets mounted on the door's interior, extending into a mortise cut deep into the adjacent wall log. When engaged, the beam physically connected the door to the wall structure. Opening the door from outside with the beam engaged would require tearing out an entire section of wall. The construction reached completion on December 8, 1842. Torsten had worked for 5 months straight, from mid-July through the first week of winter, investing over 1,000 hours of labor into a structure that most of the settlement considered an elaborate monument to grief and obsession. The outer cabin's massive hinged doors were fitted and hung, completing the fortress that had consumed an entire season. Torsten moved his family into the inner cabin on a cold December afternoon. Ingrid carried their cooking pots and utensils. Anders helped his father move the sleeping platform they had built inside the new space. Little Bjorn carried blankets that dragged in the dirt behind him. Their possessions were few, made fewer by the summer's neglect of everything except construction. The settlement's harvest had been good. Root cellars were full of potatoes, turnips, and carrots. Grain bins held wheat and oats. Families had slaughtered pigs and preserved meat for winter. The Hofstad family had none of these things in abundance. Torsten's minimal garden plot had produced a sparse harvest, barely enough to supplement whatever game he could hunt and whatever charity the settlement women provided out of concern for the children. Knut Viken visited the completed structure and walked through it with genuine wonder despite his previous skepticism. The outer cabin was vast and empty, a protective shell with nothing inside except the glowing inner cabin sitting in its center like a jewel in a box. The 4-foot gap surrounding the inner cabin seemed wasteful until Knut considered what Torsten had explained about trapped air and heat retention. "It is impressive," Knut admitted, standing in the space between the two structures. "But was it worth starving your children? Was it worth 5 months that could have been spent hunting, planting, preparing properly for winter?" Torsten was lighting the first fire in the inner cabin's stone fireplace and did not turn around. "We will see. Winter answers all questions about shelter." Lars Onstad's assessment was less charitable. "Built like a jail cell," he declared at the trading post. "The man imprisoned himself and his children in a cage made of logs and wasted air. When their food runs out in February, they can eat their fancy windows and burn their expensive door to stay warm." Inside the inner cabin, the Hofstad family gathered around their table for the first meal in their new home. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace. The 4 canvas windows glowed with diffused light. The massive door was closed and barred. Rusty the cat explored the corners, sniffing at the clay, chinking, testing the warmth of the floor near the hearth. Anders noticed something immediately. The warmth from the fire filled the space evenly. There were no cold corners, no drafts stealing heat from his back while his face burned from proximity to flames. They sat comfortably 10 feet from the hearth, a distance that would have been unbearably cold in their old cabin. Torsten said nothing, but he watched his children's faces as they discovered the comfort he had built for them. The settlement thought him mad. History would judge whether his madness was folly or genius. The first significant snowfall came on December 20th, 1842, dropping 6 inches of white powder across Montana territory overnight. Families woke to the familiar routine of winter life, stoking fires that had burned low during the night, breaking ice on water buckets, bundling in layers of wool and fur before venturing outside to tend livestock or gather firewood. In the Hofstad cabin, Anders woke to something he had never experienced before. The interior was still warm, not the deep warmth of summer, but a comfortable temperature that required only a single blanket rather than the pile of coverings he had needed in their previous home. The fire in the stone fireplace had burned down to coals overnight, yet the chill that usually accompanied morning had not penetrated the inner cabin's walls. Torsten rose and added wood to the coals, building the fire back up with a few split logs. In a standard cabin, this process would require significant effort and time to restore heat that had fled during the night. In the inner cabin, the fire caught quickly, and the temperature rose within minutes to genuine comfort. Ingrid prepared cornmeal mush for breakfast, while Anders and Bjorn played on the floor near the hearth. The boys were not pressed against the fireplace seeking warmth. They sat 8 feet away, playing with wooden blocks Torsten had carved, comfortable in their shirt sleeves while snow fell outside and the temperature dropped to 15 degrees above zero. The outer cabin's doors remained closed, sealing the air gap between the structures. Torsten had explained that the still air would warm slightly from the inner cabin's heat radiation, creating a buffer zone that insulated them from the exterior cold. Anders did not fully understand the physics, but he understood the result. They were warm with a small fire, while neighbors burned logs at 3 times the rate to achieve less comfort. Knut Viken visited in late afternoon, bringing a haunch of venison as a gift. When Torsten opened the inner cabin's door to let him enter, Knut felt the wave of warm air that flowed out, and his eyes widened. Inside, the family sat at their table wearing light clothing, the fire burning moderately, the space genuinely comfortable. Knut looked around in confusion. "How much wood have you burned today?" Torsten gestured to a small stack of split logs near the fireplace. 6 pieces since morning? Maybe 7? Knut's expression showed disbelief. 6 pieces? I have burned 20 maintaining half this warmth. My children sleep in their coats. We huddle near the fire for meals. How is this possible? The air between the cabins does not move, Torsten explained patiently. It traps the heat. The outer cabin blocks the wind completely. No cold air touches these walls. The warmth stays inside because there is nowhere for it to go. Knut walked to the inner cabin's wall and placed his palm against the logs. They were warm to the touch, radiating heat gently. "I doubted you," Knut said quietly. "I thought grief had broken your mind. I was wrong." Torsten nodded acknowledgement but showed no satisfaction. "Tell the others. When they need help rebuilding, I will teach them." January 1843 brought cold that surpassed anything the settlement had experienced in the previous 5 years. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero and stayed there for 2 weeks straight. Animals froze in their shelters despite being housed in barns. Water froze solid in buckets within minutes of being brought indoors. The cold was profound, relentless, testing every structure and every family's preparation for winter survival. In standard frontier cabins, families suffered despite burning enormous quantities of firewood. The Lars Onstead household went through 2 full cords of wood in the first week of deep cold, stoking their fire constantly to maintain interior temperatures that barely reached 40 degrees. The family wore every piece of clothing they owned, layered over each other. They moved their sleeping pallets within 3 feet of the fireplace, risking burns to avoid the deadly chill that dominated the far corners of their cabin. Mrs. Onstead developed a persistent cough from smoke inhalation. Keeping the fire large enough to generate adequate heat meant creating thick smoke that had to vent through the chimney, but some always leaked into the cabin's interior, making breathing difficult. Their 3 children showed signs of chilblains on their fingers and toes, despite being indoors constantly. The Viken household fared slightly better due to Knut's careful construction techniques, but they still struggled. Knut spent entire days doing nothing but splitting firewood and feeding the fire. His winter wood supply, which he had estimated would last until March, was being consumed at twice the expected rate. He lay awake at night calculating whether they would run out before spring and what they would burn when the supply exhausted. The settlement's livestock suffered terribly. Several families lost chickens that froze despite being housed in coops. One family's milk cow died in the barn overnight when the temperature inside the structure dropped below the animal's tolerance. The loss represented not just the cow's value, but the milk it would have provided through winter and spring. Smoke columns rose from every cabin in thick plumes, visible for miles, evidence of desperate fires burning at maximum output. The settlement's communal woodpile maintained for emergencies was being rapidly depleted as families who had underestimated winter's severity sought supplemental fuel. At the Hofstad cabin, life continued with relative normalcy. Torsten burned approximately one-third the wood that standard cabins required to maintain superior comfort. The inner cabin's temperature held steady at 58 to 62 degrees with moderate fire. The family wore normal indoor clothing. The children played freely throughout the space rather than clustering near the hearth. Rusty the cat slept on the floor in the center of the room, a position that would have been lethally cold in any other structure. Lars Onstad noticed the thin smoke rising from the Hofstad chimney and commented bitterly at the trading post. Either Torsten has discovered how to create heat from nothing, or his family is freezing while he pretends his foolish design works. The blizzard struck on January 28, 1843, arriving with shocking speed. The morning had been merely cold, the sky gray but unremarkable. By noon, wind began rising from the northwest, bringing with it a wall of white that erased the landscape. Within 2 hours, visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, and wind speeds reached 40 miles per hour. Families who had been outside tending livestock or gathering firewood barely made it back to their cabins before the full force of the storm hit. The blizzard brought not just snow, but driving wind that found every gap in every structure, transforming cabins into barely adequate shelters against conditions that could kill an exposed person in minutes. Torsten closed the outer cabin's massive hinged doors as the storm intensified, sealing the air gap completely. The doors were heavy, enough and well fitted enough that wind could not penetrate them. Inside the outer shell, protected from the direct assault of the blizzard, the air remained relatively still. Inside the inner cabin, the Hofstad family was entirely insulated from the chaos outside. Anders pressed his face to one of the canvas windows, watching the white fury beyond. Snow accumulated on the outer cabin's roof and walls, building up in thick layers. Torsten had explained that the snow would actually help them, adding insulation to the outer structure. The boy found this difficult to believe, but he had learned to trust his father's counterintuitive claims about heat and cold. The storm's roar was audible but muted. The double-wall construction dampened sound as effectively as it retained heat. Inside the inner cabin, the family could hold normal conversations without shouting. The fire crackled peacefully in the stone fireplace. The 4 windows glowed with amber light. The space felt secure, almost serene, despite the violence occurring beyond the walls. Ingrid prepared a simple dinner of salt pork and beans. The family ate at their table, comfortable in the warmth, while outside the temperature continued dropping. Torsten allowed himself a small measure of satisfaction. The blizzard was providing the ultimate test of his design, and the design was performing exactly as he had calculated. At the Onstad cabin, half a mile away, Lars and his family huddled within arm's reach of a fire they fed constantly. Wind shrieked through gaps in the chinking, creating drafts that made maintaining heat nearly impossible. They burned through half a cord of wood in the first 12 hours of the blizzard. Lars's wife wrapped the children in every blanket they owned, but still they shivered. The cabin's interior walls showed frost forming in the corners, despite the roaring fire. Across the settlement, similar scenes played out. Families burning furniture when firewood ran low. Children crying from cold despite being indoors. Parents making desperate calculations about fuel and survival. The blizzard had become a crisis that exposed every weakness in standard frontier construction. By the 3rd day of the blizzard, the settlement was in genuine crisis. Snow had accumulated to depths of 4 feet in open areas, 5 or 6 feet where drifting occurred. The temperature had not risen above 25 degrees below zero in 72 hours. Wind continued to howl, preventing any outdoor activity more complex than desperately gathering firewood from sheltered piles. The Solberg family's situation had become critical. Gunnar Solberg had underestimated his winter wood supply, and 3 days of constant burning to fight the cold had exhausted most of what remained. His youngest child, a girl of 4 years named Liv, was showing signs of serious cold exposure despite being inside the cabin continuously. Her fingers had turned white, then gray, indicating frostbite was developing, even indoors. Gunnar's wife, Astrid, held Liv near the fire, trying to warm the child's hands without causing the burning pain that came from warming frozen flesh too quickly. The other children huddled together on the sleeping platform, wrapped in every piece of fabric the family owned. The cabin's interior temperature hovered around 35 degrees despite a fire consuming wood at an unsustainable rate. At the Onstad cabin, Lars had been forced to begin burning furniture. His winter wood supply was not exhausted, but he was burning it so rapidly that running out before spring became a certainty. He broke up a chair and fed it into the fire piece by piece, watching the flames consume craftsmanship he had spent days creating the previous summer. His children watched with wide, frightened eyes, old enough to understand that burning furniture meant desperation. The settlement's communal woodpile was nearly gone. Families who had contributed generously in autumn now regretted their charity as their own supplies dwindled. The few men who attempted to venture into the forest to cut emergency firewood found the task impossible in blizzard conditions. Visibility was too poor, the cold was too severe, the snow was too deep. Inside the Hofstad cabin, life continued with surreal normalcy. Torsten burned 6 to 8 logs per day, maintaining comfortable warmth with a fraction of the fuel other families consumed. The children played, studied reading lessons Ingrid taught them, and ate regular meals. Rusty the cat slept peacefully near the fireplace, content in the steady warmth. Anders asked his father if they should help the neighbors. Torsten stood at the window, looking out at the white fury, barely able to see the outline of the outer cabin's walls through the blowing snow. "We cannot reach them in this," he said quietly. "The storm is too strong, but when it passes, we will help whoever needs help." On the 4th day, Gunnar Solberg made the desperate decision to attempt reaching the Hofstad cabin. He had seen the thin smoke rising from Torsten's chimney and realized that somehow, impossibly, the double cabin was using very little fuel. He bundled himself in every warm garment he owned, waited for a brief lull in the wind, and set out into the blizzard. Gunnar Solberg's journey across half a mile of blizzard-buried landscape took nearly an hour and almost killed him. Snow had drifted to chest height in places. Wind threatened to knock him down with every gust. The temperature was 28 degrees below zero, with wind chill making it feel closer to 50 below. Exposed skin would freeze in under 2 minutes. He navigated by memory and occasional glimpses of landmarks when the snow cleared briefly. Twice he lost direction completely and had to stop to regain his bearings. His beard froze solid with ice from his breath. His fingers and toes went numb despite heavy gloves and boots. When he finally saw the outline of the Hofstad outer cabin, through the blowing snow, he nearly wept with relief. The outer cabin's doors were massive, designed to be opened from inside or outside with significant effort. Gunnar pushed on them with all his remaining strength, and they swung inward, revealing the sheltered space between the structures. Out of the direct wind, the air was merely cold rather than lethally frigid. Gunnar stumbled forward and pounded on the inner cabin's door with numb fists. Anders heard the pounding and alerted his father. Torsten opened the door to find Gunnar Solberg standing in the gap between cabins, snow-covered and shaking violently. "We need help," Gunnar gasped through frozen lips. "The children are freezing. We have no more wood. Please." Torsten pulled Gunnar into the warm interior. The sudden temperature change made Gunnar dizzy. He had been exposed to severe cold for over an hour, and his body was shutting down. Torsten sat him near the fire and wrapped him in blankets while Ingrid prepared hot broth from their limited supplies. "How many in your family?" Torsten asked. "5," Gunnar managed through chattering teeth. "Wife, 3 children. The youngest has frostbite. We are burning furniture. We will not survive another day." Torsten nodded and began gathering supplies. Extra blankets, what little food they could spare. He filled a canvas bag with split firewood from his carefully managed pile. "I will come with you," Torsten said. "We bring your family here. They stay with us until the storm passes." Gunnar looked around the small inner cabin, seeing the 4 Hofstad family members in a space barely large enough for them. "We cannot all fit," he protested weakly. Torsten shook his head. "We fit. We make room. No one freezes while I have warmth to share." When Gunnar had warmed enough to walk, he and Torsten ventured back into the blizzard, following Gunnar's trail while it was still partially visible. They reached the Solberg cabin and found Astrid and the children huddled around a failing fire, the last of the furniture burning in the hearth. Little Liv's hands were wrapped in cloth, her face pale with cold, despite being indoors. The blizzard ended on the morning of the 6th day, leaving Montana territory buried under 6 feet of snow in places, and transformed by wind-sculpted drifts that reshaped the landscape. The temperature remained below 0, but the wind had died, and pale sunlight filtered through breaking clouds. Families emerged from their cabins to assess damage and check on neighbors. The settlement had survived, but barely. 2 families had lost all their livestock. The communal woodpile was completely exhausted. Every household had burned through far more fuel than anticipated, leaving spring supplies dangerously low. One elderly man, living alone in a poorly constructed cabin, had nearly died and was found unconscious by neighbors who broke through his door when smoke stopped rising from his chimney. Word spread quickly about the Solberg family taking shelter at the Hofstad cabin. Curious and concerned, neighbors began making their way through the deep snow to see how 5 additional people could possibly survive in Torsten's structure. What they found challenged everything they thought they understood about frontier shelter. The outer cabin showed massive snow accumulation on its walls and roof, but the structure stood solid and undamaged. Inside the outer shell, in the 4-foot gap between structures, the air was cold but still, perhaps 20 degrees warmer than the exterior temperature. The inner cabin glowed with warmth, its 4 windows shining like amber lanterns. Inside, 9 people occupied a space designed for 4, but the crowding was manageable because the temperature remained comfortable throughout the interior. The Solberg children played with Anders and Bjorn on the floor. Adults sat at the table drinking hot tea. The fire burned moderately, consuming wood at a rate that seemed impossible, given the warmth it generated. Lars Onstad arrived with Knut Viken, both men exhausted from days of desperate fire maintenance. They stepped into the inner cabin and stood speechless. Lars had burned nearly 4 cords of wood over 6 days. His family had suffered constant cold despite his efforts. His cabin's interior walls showed ice damage that would require repair. And here stood Torsten Hofstad, sheltering 9 people in comfort, his wood supply barely depleted. "How?" Lars asked, the mockery gone from his voice, replaced by genuine need to understand. Torsten gestured around the cabin. "The outer shell stops the wind. The air between cabins does not move, does not steal heat. The inner cabin is sealed tight. Heat from the fire stays trapped. The snow on the outer walls adds more insulation. The system works together. Each part makes the other parts work better." Knut walked to the inner cabin wall and touched the logs. They were warm, radiating heat gently into the space. He examined the chinking, noting how perfectly sealed every gap was. He looked at the windows, the door, the roof construction visible above. "Will you teach us?" he asked. Will you help us rebuild our cabins using these methods? Torsten nodded slowly. That is why I built this, not just for my family, for everyone who needs to survive winter. 5 years passed. The winter of 1848 found Anders Hofstad at 14 years old, tall and strong, working alongside his father on the construction of the settlement's 12th double-wall cabin. The technique had spread methodically through the community as families rebuilt or constructed new structures using principles Torsten had demonstrated. Not every family adopted the design. Some still considered the labor investment too high, the material cost too great. But those who faced serious cold exposure or who lost cabins to structural failure during subsequent hard winters came to Torsten asking for instruction. He taught them freely, spending weeks helping neighbors build double-wall structures that would protect them. The cabins varied in details based on available materials and individual skill levels. Some used Torsten's clay horsehair resin chinking mixture. Others developed their own variations. Some built with the same 4-foot air gap. Others economized with 3 feet. But the core principle remained consistent. 2 walls separated by still air. Outer structure taking weather and wind. Inner structure sealed and heated, the dead air between them serving as insulation. Travelers passing through the settlement began calling them Hofstad cabins, a name that spread to neighboring valleys. The double-wall technique became associated with Norwegian craftsmanship and practical engineering that prioritized survival over speed. Families building new homesteads in the Montana Territory specifically sought Norwegian immigrants to teach them the construction method. Anders had learned every aspect of the building process. He could select proper timber, notch corners with precision, mix and apply chinking, and construct the complex double-roof system. Torsten's knowledge would not die with him, but would pass to the next generation and beyond. Rusty the cat, now old and gray-muzzled, still lived with the family. The orange Tom had survived 6 Montana winters in comfort that few frontier animals experienced. He slept in the center of the inner cabin's floor, a position that demonstrated the even heat distribution Torsten's design achieved. On a February evening, Anders and Torsten stood in the gap between the walls of the cabin they were building for a young family newly arrived from Sweden. Snow fell gently outside. The inner cabin was complete, its windows glowing warm. The outer shell needed only roof completion. "Do you remember when everyone called this madness?" Anders asked. Torsten smiled slightly, a rare expression. "I remember. I also remember your mother freezing despite fires, burning 6 feet away. This cabin would have saved her. These cabins will save others. That is enough." They stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by still air that trapped warmth and demonstrated physics that frontier settlers had not understood until tragedy taught one man to see shelter differently. The impossible had become routine. A cabin inside a cabin was no longer mocked, but copied. And Torsten Hofstad's obsession, born from grief and perfected through determination, had changed how people survived in one of the harshest environments the American frontier offered. The knowledge spread quietly, carved not in words but in notched logs and sealed walls and still air that refused to steal heat from those it protected.